This first part of the heart lectures is going to give you a very brief overview of the function of the heart and then launch right in on looking at the external structures of the heart. So obviously, if you didn't know already, the heart's job is to circulate blood throughout the body. And it does that by having myocytes in the heart muscle itself contract. And that happens on average about 100,000 times a day. We call those heartbeats. And those heartbeats add up to about 3 billion in an average person's lifespan. If you want to think about it in terms of, well, how much, what volume of blood does the heart circulate every day? Well, it's somewhere around, depending on the individual, about 4,000 gallons of blood every day. Obviously, you don't have 4,000 gallons. You only have just a much smaller amount than that, but that's blood that's being recirculated throughout the body. And there are two main circuits in which the blood circulates. We'll learn more about this when we look at blood vessels in a couple of weeks, but the pulmonary circuit is a collection of blood vessels that leave the right side of the heart, go through the lungs, and return on the left side of the heart. And then there's the systemic circuit, which exits on the left side of the heart, goes throughout the body, and then returns to the right side of the heart. So let's take a look at the anatomical features of the heart. We'll start on the outside of the heart, and we'll work our way inward. Now, one real quick thing to mention here is this term called mediastinum, which you'll hear people use. Mediastinum refers to the location in the thorax or the chest cavity where the heart is oriented. And let me back up to this previous slide here. Oops, not 2 slides back, just 1. And I'll outline for you right here. Boy, I'm having problems today with this. There we go. Here's the heart located in the chest cavity. It's more or less kind of located along the midline. It's a little off to the left, but more or less it's along the midline of the chest, located immediately deep to the sternum. We call this region the mediastinum. You'll notice that the heart is oriented so that the broadest portion of the heart up here is located superiorly, and the point of the heart, which is called the apex, is located inferiorly. We call the broad part at the top the base. I know that seems odd, but because it's the broadest part, they call that the base of the heart. The apex of the heart is the point or the tip of the heart that's located inferiorly. The heart is surrounded by a serous membrane called the pericardium. You'll remember that serous membranes from your studies in Bio 201 are double-layered membranes filled with a fluid in between. That fluid is used as a lubricating mechanism to assist the structure from and prevent friction rub. I'll talk about that on the next slide in more detail. And then when we look at the actual heart itself, it consists of 3 different layers. Starting from the outside, working our way inward, we have the epicardium, the myocardium, where all of the muscle cells are located. That's the thickest part here. And then the endocardium is a thin layer lining the chambers. So a few words about the pericardium. Again, the pericardium is a serous membrane, meaning that it has an external or parietal layer of tissue, an internal or visceral layer of tissue, and a cavity in between those 2 layers that's filled with the fluid for lubrication. If we look at the heart up close here and we were to blow this up so you could see it better, you'd see that the outer parietal pericardium consists of actually a fibrous outer coating that contains lots of collagen fibers. It's actually, if you want to know, dense irregular connective tissue, so you can pull it in multiple directions and it won't tear. Inside of that dense irregular connective tissue layer is a moist serous layer of epithelial cells. Then there's a space represented in this drawing by black, and that space is called the serous or pericardial cavity in this case. And then there's an inner visceral pericardial layer. The visceral pericardium, or the inner layer of the serous membrane, is the same as the epicardium, or the outermost layer of the heart. They are one and the same. So just get used to people referring to either the visceral pericardium or the epicardium and know that they are basically one and the same. As I said, in between these two layers is this cavity filled with serous fluid, and that fluid serves as a lubrication. You remember that the heart is situated inside that thoracic cavity. And that thoracic cavity contains lungs on either side of the heart, and it's all encased within the ribs. Well, that's an enclosed space. There's only so much room available, so that every time the heart contracts and then relaxes again, to contract, relax, it is rubbing up against the adjacent lungs. It's rubbing up against the adjacent sternum and the ribs. And if we didn't have some way to lubricate that movement, the heart would very quickly develop friction rubs, or the equivalent of blisters, just like you do if you go out for a long hike in a new pair of hiking boots. So the pericardial fluid is really important for reducing or eliminating friction, and it should come as no surprise to you that if somebody stops producing pericardial fluid, which can happen in certain kinds of infections, you can develop a condition called pericarditis. Pericarditis means inflammation of the pericardium. Just a hint here, anytime you see a word ending in itis, itis, that means inflammation of. And in pericarditis, obviously, if I don't have any fluid in the pericardial cavity, that heart muscle's rubbing up against the lungs, rubbing up against the sternum and the rib cage every time it contracts. And remember, it's contracting about 100,000 times a day. That's a lot of times for that heart to be rubbing up against its adjacent organs without any kind of lubricant. And it can be very, very painful for people who have this condition. At the opposite end of the spectrum is a condition called cardiac tamponade. And that occurs if you get too much fluid accumulating in the pericardial cavity. So in this case, remember again, the heart is in an enclosed space. So if I suddenly have too much fluid accumulating in the pericardial sac, that's going to start pushing in on the heart. Can't push out because the ribs are there and the lungs are there, preventing expansion. So the only thing we can do is push inward and put excessive pressure on the heart tissue itself. And this means that the ventricles, or the chambers inside the heart, cannot fill sufficiently with blood, and this impacts the heart's ability overall to circulate blood throughout the body, and it can be life-threatening. So let's take a look at the three layers of the heart. I'm only going to talk about them briefly. We'll start on the outside. We'll work our way inward. The epicardium is the outermost layer. It's a very thin layer of epithelial tissue. Again, remember, it's the same as the visceral pericardium. They are one and the same. And the outer surface of the heart, where the epicardium is located, also contains a number of grooves, or sulci. You learned this word when we were talking about the brain. Sulci is plural. Sulcus is singular. And those sulci, as you can see in this picture here, are filled with adipose tissue, with fat tissue. Next layer in is the most substantial, or the thickest layer by far, and that is the myocardium. The myocardium is made up of cardiac myocytes, and you'll remember from histology in 201, we have three different types of muscle cells: skeletal muscle cells, smooth muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells. Cardiac muscle cells, or cardiac muscle fibers, or cardiac myocytes, are all interchangeable terms, are unique because of several features. One, they're striated. Two, they're uninucleated. Three, they have this kind of branched appearance to them, as you can see in this picture here. They're not long and thin like you see with skeletal muscle. They're not tapered at both ends like a football, as in smooth muscle cells. They have their own unique form to them. Now, also found in the myocardium, along with all these myocytes, is a very important structure called the fibrous skeleton. The fibrous skeleton is a large collection distributed throughout the heart muscle, consisting of lots of collagen fibers and elastic fibers. And these are present to give the heart muscle some structure. They are points of attachment for the myocytes. So, there's sort of a scaffolding, I guess you could think of it in that way. There's sort of a scaffolding for the muscle cells. One feature I want to mention or remind you about that relates to the myocytes is how they attach to each other. And they attach to each other by these specialized structures called intercalated discs. And I know you learned about these with histology, but let me just remind you of a couple important features that are located in each of these intercalated discs between myocytes. First of all, in these intercalated discs, you find gap junctions. Gap junctions are holes or points of continuity between one myocyte and the next myocyte, and they are like little tunnels that connect the cytoplasm of one cell to the cytoplasm of another. Oops, I drew that on the wrong part there. Here they are. Here's our gap junctions. And they allow for action potentials to travel from one myocyte to another very rapidly. And in essence, this means that the myocytes of the heart may contract as a single unit. They contract simultaneously, if you will. The other important feature found in intercalated discs that I want to mention briefly are the desmosomes. These are the points of anchoring or attachment between muscle cells. They are kind of like little spot weld points of attachment here. And they allow for, obviously, myocytes to stay connected to one another, but also to stretch in relationship to one another without tearing apart from each other. Moving inward, the innermost layer of the heart is the endocardium. The endocardium is contiguous or continuous with the innermost layer of blood vessels, which is called the vascular endothelium. And both the endocardium and the vascular endothelium are made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue. And we'll have more really to say about this when we look at the blood vessels and we look more closely at vascular endothelium. For now, we'll just know that that's the kind of tissue it's made up. It lines all of the chambers inside of the heart. And that's good enough about the endocardium for now. Next up, we'll talk about the chambers inside the heart, the blood vessels that connect to the heart, and the valves that are located within the heart.